and welcome to the Security Collective podcast. I'm your host, Claire Pales, and today's guest is Gary Jackson. Gary is the Vice President for Australia Pacific at Tenable, the cyber exposure company helping 30,000 organisations around the globe understand and reduce cyber risk. Gary joined Tenable to lead the Asia Pacific region and build the reputation and coverage of Tenable in the risk-based vulnerability management space. His career spans more than 40 years in the technology industry, and prior to joining Tenable, Gary held various regional vice president roles with Cisco, EMC and Aruba Networks. Gary, thanks so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Pleasure, Claire. Happy to be here.
We're now in an era where organisations are part of an absolutely interconnected value chain, where behaviours of one organisation impact the security of another. I thought it might be a good place to start in talking about what's been your experience in influencing behaviour between different organisations, senior stakeholders. Given that you're working for a software vendor, you must have these conversations all the time.
Yes. Well, I mean, the attack surface has grown substantially, obviously, in recent times. Just the sheer breadth of the recent cyber attacks. The stakes are pretty high for CISOs and their teams. The boards are nervous and CEOs are nervous. And it's interesting. In the year 2020, there were about 18,000 new vulnerabilities. The year before, it was about 17,000. So, there's over 100,000, and it's really hard for organisations to manage all that. It's also a real challenge if they're looking at things like acquisitions or expansions of their business. We're a good example too. We've got a lot of interconnects ourselves. Our CISO and our internal folks running business platforms have got massive issues in terms of, do we take on this particular application? What's it going to do for us? What's their profile? We're getting a lot of questions that now, before we can even make submissions to some companies, they send us a very detailed risk profile that we have to fill in. You never had to do that, right? You would sometimes sign a non-disclosure and make certain agreements under an NDA, but some of these are very, very detailed. We just had a very detailed one from a Japan organisation. We've had a very detailed one in the last couple of weeks from one of the big banks in Australia. So the interconnects are really serious as well. And, why we have focused a lot on enabling vulnerability management to be a risk-based assessment is because there's just too many of them. And it's very, very hard to enable CISOs and their teams. What are they going to focus on? Where do they make the decisions of focus?
And when CISOs are choosing tools like Tenable or any of the security tools that they want to use to assess or protect their organisations, they usually have to go to the powers that be, like the board and the executives, and ask for, some serious investment that can often be hard to quantify, I suppose. How do you go about designing some of the right metrics for CISOs so that they can go back to the decision makers around investment and help them to understand the effectiveness of, putting some money in place to make sure that they've got the right tools to protect the organisation?
Yes, metrics, obviously, return on investment. Where are the numbers? And they're perfectly valid questions, before you spend money on anything. We go through the same thing, our CISO has to justify things and our biz platforms folks for the same reasons, why should we spend that money? What are we going to get out of it? And I think that's one of the areas we've focused really strongly on why we're very well regarded as the number one in risk-based vulnerability management, not just VM, because metrics do matter. You have to be able to show some kind of numerical value, I think, to justify it. Just makes it a lot easier for a CISO. The old red, amber, green. When you look at last year where there were 18,000 new vulnerabilities, and under the CVSS scoring, which a lot of people use to define their red, amber, green, just under 60% of those 18,000 were classed as high or critical. That's 10,000 in just in 1 year. The year before, it was pretty much the same on the 17,000 there. So obviously you declare critical as red. You obviously declare low as green, because they have low, medium, high, critical. That's kind of the brackets. Well, low is only 2% of the number, so there's not a lot of green if that's how you decide to do it. And how do you decide where medium or high sits between amber and red? And it's going to be an incredibly long list of reds. So the boards and they say, well, what does this mean? Where am I supposed to? You're asking for a lot of money. There's not a lot of clarity here, and the CVSS scores are just too general. They are, and this is where we've created the cyber exposure score. This is why we're doing so well in this space. The cyber exposure score we generate it by combining our vulnerability priority rating with our asset criticality rating. The vulnerability priority rating it's predictive. It's based use out of our data science AI group. So we have a substantial data science group that's very AI driven in terms of analysing the data. And the VPR score it's a predictive prioritisation that's based on the probability that particular vulnerability will be attacked, which is based on history, based on where it is, based on what devices, etc. The asset criticality rating, which is the other component of the cyber exposure score that we actually give, that values an asset based on where is it in the network, what kind of asset is it, what's the functionality of that asset. That all goes into a kind of an AI assessment. Well, how critical is that particular asset combined with the VPR rating? That gives us or gets our customers a cyber exposure score. The other thing about that, once they've got that, and so they can go, and by the way, what we wind up defining as what would be called critical is more like 3 to 5%, not 60%. So there's a very defined, list that they can go and say, these are the ones we've got to worry about, and it's really worth us spending the money because we've got a very, very clear, defined score, a defined group to focus on for all of the right reasons, for a mathematical assessment as to why we should, and to go and remediate those, and then to compare that as we go, because that's the other thing they can do once they have that is, each month they can say, well, that's our cyber exposure score a month ago. This is what it is now. Is it any better? Is it hopefully not any worse? And also they can get to compare it because we've got so much data against peers in that vertical organisation. So they can say, well, compared to other FSIs in Australia, we're at the top, we're in the middle, etc. So it's a very detailed analysis, and more importantly, it's a metric that they can go to their execs with, and that's getting a heck of a lot of traction from the market with our risk-based vulnerability management scoring.
I think one of the challenges with that type of scoring is that you are trying to explain the risk to a business audience or to an executive audience. And, at the end of the day, cyber is a business risk. It's not just for the technology team to be managing. And I've got a lot of clients who are in the fintech space or in, smaller organisations that might be making acquisitions. And, they're going through these huge amounts of growth and constant innovation. And, that level of scale and complexity brings even more risk. So how do you sort of balance this, growing businesses with the implications of making decisions around vulnerabilities and what you remediate and what you don't? I mean, just the conversation that we just had around the complex nature of even scoring these vulnerabilities to then, attach a new business that brings with it so much risk as well. I mean, how are we explaining this to businesses in a language that they understand?
Yeah, it's not easy. I mean, and I think obviously just giving them a score I think that it's a great metric. But it also enables, there's backing behind that. One of the points we make is whether you're a fairly static organisation or you're an expanding one, either way, you have to be able to see what you've got. right? So, we kind of do the three-step thing, see what you've got, which means everything. Now, if you're looking to acquire somebody, you've got to be able to have some conversations in the non-disclosure period, in the actual due diligence of what's their profile look like. That's going to get a lot harder and a lot more specific. I've got some interesting little stats in a minute, but so our first thing is you have to be able to see everything you've got, whatever the asset is, wherever it is, and that's the first thing. So the point we make is we enable you to identify and see every device wherever it is, because the network is expanded dramatically. It's not, you can't just do a firewall on the other side of switches and routers anymore, right? I mean, that's obviously still important, but the network perimeter is just everywhere. And work from home just expanded network perimeters even more significantly. So, the remote workforce is just a really important thing for people to understand. So our first bit is see everything you've got, and you might be surprised what you don't know is there. And the fact is, if you can go and show to the business leaders, we know what we've got. I mean, that's important, guys, right? Agreed. We've got a predictive, an accurate predictive assessment as to where we need to go and take action, and we've got the ability to go and take that action because it's a much more defined approach for us to take. I mean, you can't fix 60% of, you can't go and patch 60 or figure out what the priorities are with 60% of 18,000, which was, I mean, how I need another 40 people, by the way, to do that. So not only do I need to spend money on the software, I need another 40 people. I mean, so I think we're getting a lot of traction in the fact that you can go through that see, predict, act as a kind of a piece of logic that a business person can get their head around, I think, and that you are backing it up with some metrics. A couple of interesting things I saw as I was reading through. Do you know that when Verizon acquired Yahoo, they then belatedly found out that Yahoo had two serious attacks, and they reduced their offer by $350 million, which was 7% of their offer. So, I mean, there is a very quantifiable example of you not only have to have some comfort, because they discovered that very late in the piece. And part of that was the parts of Yahoo that they didn't buy still have a 50% liability should subsequent attacks occur in that area. So, it's really interesting. There's going to be monetary penalties that I think are going to become part of mergers and acquisitions decisions. So, yeah, I do think that the expansion, it's just true no matter what you're doing. Whether you are a relatively static organisation that's not acquiring, you still need to know everything you've got. You still need to know every device and what is the potential of those being exposed so that you can take some practical action. We are finding that CISOs, it gives them a much better, I think, business approach. It also helps be far more efficient with the team. I mean, you don't need as many people and as many hours in the day if you've got a more focused approach to take.
I think just, coming back to that due diligence in mergers and acquisitions, one of my concerns is that a lot of that activity can be taken through a compliance lens. So, if an organisation is compliant with certain standards or with certain regulations, then it's seen that they would have, or assumed that they would therefore have, appropriate security. And, we all know that compliance doesn't equal security, or certainly not effective security. So, how can security leaders start to talk about this, not from a compliance perspective or a security perspective, but from a risk-based approach? And you mentioned earlier in the chat, but I know you're really passionate about this risk-based approach, and I'd love to hear some of your thoughts around how do we move away from compliance and security in isolation and really sort of be thinking about what does effective risk management or a risk-based approach look like?
Yeah, well, I mean, absolutely. It's the very reason we came up with the cyber exposure scoring and risk-based VM versus certainly at the CISO levels, I think absolutely they really understand the difference between a not very well defined bunch of stuff to a metric that has some logic behind it. I do think that's more explainable. It's obviously a very fundamental part of our go-to-market that, guys, we're the leader in risk-based vulnerability management. This does matter. It should matter to you, and it should matter to your organisation. And I absolutely agree about compliance. I mean, we've got, Australia has the IRAP, Japan has a thing called ISMAP, FedRAMP in the USA, which you have to comply with. I mean, and it takes real work from a product and a company structure point of view to actually get the FedRAMP tick. And of course, federal or government is a huge vertical for us, right? I mean, the Australian government, we're very strong, the US government, Singapore government. So you have to meet those standards or compliance requirements. Some of them are more aggressive and tougher than others. GDPR in Europe, of course, which has an ESA thing underneath it. So, yes, I think obviously compliance is important, but that's not going to tell you the whole story. And I think if we can continue to push the point that it's all about risk, guys, and risk is about what you've got, how you've deployed. The other interesting stat I just remembered from Price Waterhouse, security incidents, they found that 56% were from existing or past employees, which is interesting, 23% unknown hackers, 20% competitors, which also surprised me, and 19% third parties, which gets back to that, who am I linking to, right? And we all have, I would say most medium to large organisations would have to have 50 apps that they use regularly, at least, if not more.
At least.
So that interconnection is a big issue.
And so given all of that, how can people start with a risk-based approach? For many years, maybe a CISO hasn't been taking that approach and they've been taking a much more sort of literal, there are 60,000 things or 60% of things for me to resolve because they're high and critical. Where's the best place to start if you want to narrow down, what's essential and what's important and what's going to reduce or minimise our risk?
Right. Well, obviously it's very dependent on the size of the organisation. Do they have internal expertise or not that you can work with? Are they outsourced? Do they rely on a service provider? And then they have very, very important questions they should be asking of their service provider. Is it an outsource? Is it a managed service? I think it's important to try and help them understand that it's a critical adoption and measurement process, no matter how big they are. I've heard the question sometimes, should we be selling it as an enabler? I think you should avoid that word because that just puts I'm not sure I'd call things enablers. I'd call them critical in terms of being a more secure organisation. That's how I see it. And it does still surprise / sometimes frustrate me that as we go through this, there's a kind of toe in the water approach. Well, we'll do an RBVM for the desktops, or we'll do an R for the main data centers, and we'll look at the rest later, see how it goes. I always feel like it's me ringing up the insurance company and say, look, I'm in a flood zone. I want to have a flood protection on my main bedroom, but not the rest of the house, and I'll see how that goes. So I think it's important that we kind of tailor the discussion and the approach depending on the expertise. We are going to base it around risk-based vulnerability assessment, absolutely. And it's a responsibility. I think it's more trying to get clear that it's a responsibility, whether you've got a CISO or not, however big your internal organisation. This is a real responsibility.
Just looping back to something that you just mentioned around, security being a business enabler. I'm absolutely with you. And I've talked about this on another podcast this season already, that I don't see security as an enabler either. I think it doesn't enable what the business is trying to do. It certainly supports the business strategy and should support where the business is trying to go and innovation. But I certainly wouldn't suggest it's an enabler. And, an enabler can have two different definitions, one very positive and one very negative. But, I guess from your perspective, something that I've grappled with and I see my peers grapple with is this, positioning of cyber with fear, uncertainty and doubt. You don't want to come to your executives and your board and, paint this doomsday picture for them. But I guess with your approach, you're sort of coming to them and saying, okay, this is the ultimate stuff that needs to be resolved. We're not bringing you everything. We're taking an approach that says, this is really what could get us into trouble. How can people articulate that without the fear, uncertainty and doubt, without the FUD factor? Because you're still coming to them with sort of the real critical ones at the end of the day. What's your advice in that perspective?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. Of course, it's going to get down a lot to the capabilities of CISOs. I mean, having been in the industry as long as I have, when CIOs started, and yes, I was around when they started, they were this weird techos as well, right? And it took quite a long while for them to be genuine. Now they're typically on the executive staff. I mean, the CIO is, right? The CISO in general is still not there yet, which I think this is an important intellectual decision that large companies in particular and MIDs need to make. That person is as much a part of the business future of this company as both. CIO is important, absolutely. There's a lot of infrastructure stuff that's critical. Risk of being attacked is a critical business issue. You have to care about this, and it's our responsibility to try and make it as explainable as possible. And absolutely going in there and saying, we're going to get hacked any day and you have to spend all this money and you're crazy if you don't. That's just kind of an insulting approach to pretty smart people if they're CEOs and on boards, right? I think that the CISOs need to be getting to be good at internal selling. That means they need to be able to be business people themselves. They just need to get better. I think the approach for them to take is, guys, we need to be industry leading. We're an industry leading brand. This is a brand, by the way. I'm big on brands. You'll remember the brand. How you see the brand will depend on how well I've gone, because it'll be a good or a bad brand, right? That's true in life for companies and individuals. And that CISO needs to have a brand that's respected. And I think if the CISOs are able to say, guys, we're in the top 4 banks in Australia. We have to be industry leading in our comparative cyber risk analysis. This is a way that we can be better at this. And I think then you can leave the word enabler out altogether. To me, that'd get my back up if I was on the board, frankly. But I think if you can focus on the fact that we need to be an industry leader, we are an industry leader, we've got a great brand, we need to protect that brand. That's kind of the approach they have to take.
Look, I couldn't agree more. And, certainly the reputation of brands can come and go very, very quickly, especially if trust is lost. And so certainly coming at it from a positive perspective, but also, you're talking the language of your audience not around the technical aspects of security and not around the fear of a cyber attack, but more around, as you said, being an industry leader and protecting the organisation's good faith that people have in them and inherent trust that people have in household name brands. I think that's a really great approach.
Yeah.
Gary, I want to thank you for joining me today. I've really enjoyed the conversation. I do want to tell my listeners this is not a sponsored post. This is absolutely a chat that I wanted to have with Gary and to share his knowledge with you. So please head to the show notes if you want any more information about Gary. And I hope you've enjoyed the chat today. So thanks again for your time.
My pleasure. Thanks very much, Claire.
Thanks so much for joining me today. If you want more information on any of our guests, head to thesecuritycollective.com/podcast. This podcast is produced by East Coast Studio. I'm Claire Pales, and I look forward to seeing you next week.